So Matthew 17, before we look at that, you've got to know it's going to be a literal mountaintop moment for Peter, James, and John. We know the story, some of us. It's called the Mount of Transfiguration, but it's helpful to look a little bit ahead of time, a little bit before that, I mean. So right before that, Peter does an awesome thing. Jesus is asking the disciples in Matthew 16, they won't have the verses up on the screen. He's going to say, who do the people say I am? And their response is, you're John the Baptist, or you're Elijah, or you're Jeremiah, or some other prophet. And he says, who do you say I am? And Peter says an awesome thing. He goes, you are God's Messiah. You're the Son of God. And Jesus affirms him so much. He goes, you don't know that because you're smart. You know that because the Holy Spirit told you that. And then he says, I'm going to call you Peter, which means rock. And I'm going to build my church on you. And he says, the gates of hell, meaning death itself, can't stop the work of the church that I'm starting on you. And then the next passage, Jesus starts to talk about the road to the cross. And he says, I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be given over. And what does Peter do? He says, never you, Lord. Why would you do it? And then what does Jesus say to him? Peter just crushed it. A+ on the exam, who do you say I am? And then he says to Peter, the same person, get behind me, Satan. Have you ever crushed it and then failed miserably? And the cool thing that I don't get God's goodness and grace to Peter or to me is that he then invites them, Peter and 2 other guys, to this awesome moment, one of the most indescribable moments we have in the Gospels. Look at Matthew chapter 17, verse 1. It says this, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured. The word is metamorphosis in Greek, before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. A couple things we want to look at is that from all of this piece, we see the radiant glory of God. If you read through the scripture, the radiant glory of God, his Shekinah glory is described in Jesus. That his face is shining like the sun, that his clothes become as white as light. You can read any story about Abraham encountering God, Moses, the Israelites, read Exodus 34 or Psalm 43 or Isaiah 6 or Hosea 6. All of it is all about when God's presence is full, it's a bright, bright, white as lightning light. And it's almost as if Jesus' body changes. It's not almost, that's what it says. It metamorphosizes into something radically different, and he still's got the clothes on, but they can't contain the light. That he's so bright and glorified that his clothes are trying to hold it in, but they shine through. It's this unbelievable scene that Peter crushed it, failed it, gets to see. And the interesting thing that he says in here in verse 3, and this is where there's so much good context, is in verse 3, he says, Moses and Elijah were with him. And you might ask, why Moses and Elijah? Another funny question is, how did Peter know it was Moses and Elijah? Because they had name tags, is the answer. There was a bubble, this is Moses, this is Elijah. Hi, Moses. Whatever, he knew. But the better question is, why Moses and Elijah? And maybe you know this about Scripture, but Moses was the person that God gave the 10 Commandments through. But Moses wasn't just the guy that had the 10 Commandments. He was the guy that led the Israelites in the wilderness, 2 million adults, for 40 years wandering in a desert. He's the same guy that was a prophet at the time when Israel had no prophets. He was called a king at a time when Israel had no king, and he was called a priest of God at a time when Israel had no priests. He was a leader among leaders, really a leader over leaders. And if you talk about a leader of people in the Bible, he is par excellence, one of the best. And when you think about the 10 Commandments, this is where Moses' name becomes synonymous with the law. That God gave the law through Moses. And so when you reference Moses, it talks about the law. Why Elijah? Because if God gave the law through Moses, Elijah was then the one through whom God guarded that law. Elijah was the prophet of prophets. He was zeal personified. You read 1st and 2nd Kings, and he's courageous and in your face. And I just read through to my Bible plan. He does weird miracles and signs. And I'm like, don't sign me up for that, God. I'm not ready to lay on my side without any clothes and eat food cooked over you know what for a year. Doesn't sound fun. It's all these crazy things, and maybe that wasn't Ezekiel, or maybe that wasn't Elijah, maybe it was somebody else. But he does all these awesome things that are unbelievable, and he is the prophet. If you look at any of the prophets, he becomes to represent all the... You should have zeal like Elijah, and we all say not like Jonah, right? Because Jonah was one of the worst. He still did God's will. But Elijah becomes synonymous with the prophets. So Moses gives the law. Elijah guards the law. And so they represent the law and the prophets, if you've heard that verse. It comes up when Jesus is talking about what is the greatest commandment. And he says it in Matthew 22. You can look there. And this was a phrase in the first century to summarize all of the Old Testament. That the law represented the first section of the book, and then the prophets represented all of the rest of it. So, what is this meaning? Is that if they are the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah, their presence then is a declaration that all of the law and the prophets, the entire Old Testament, pointed to Jesus. That's why this is a big moment. This is the one of whom we spoke. We say this all the time. The Old Testament points to Jesus. We see Jesus in the Gospels. And then the rest of the New Testament is the outworking of the church filled with the Spirit of God through Jesus. And as great as Moses was, great leader, great as Elijah was, I don't know anyone like him today. They are not glorified here. Jesus is. They're the opener for the headline band, right? The trailer for the movie. For the cynic, if you've ever doubted that Jesus was God, here's one of the most concrete proofs. It's said here in Matthew, but Mark and Luke's gospel all account this same story. And whether Peter told them, or John, or James, the point here is that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the rescuer God had planned and spoken about for thousands of years. And he's here. He's not just here in the flesh, he's the radiance of God's glory. He is unbelievable, and it's worth focusing on. Just think, put yourself in their shoes to be Peter or James or John in this moment. Like, what do you do? Nice thing is that they're kind of like us, though. Peter crushed it, failed it, and then he gets invited to this awesome mountaintop moment, literally like the mountaintop moment of anyone's life. But then they're also like us. Look at verse 4. Peter continues his up and down, he just doesn't know what to do with them. Verse 4. This is neat because verse 4 and 5 is Peter speaks and God speaks. Who do you think speaks better? Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. And that word good is excellent. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me. So if you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Read verse 6. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. You have to laugh a little bit at Peter. You can read the Bible and laugh. God is a God of humor. Peter tries to talk, and he babbles. And he was actually onto something. He's referencing an Old Testament festival called the Festival of Booths, which they would set up to remember their wandering in the wilderness. They would set up these temporary places and live in them for a week or however long the festival went on. But Peter's like, here's a good idea. Awesome transfiguration. Jesus metamorphosized, light emanating from his body that I can't even quite look at. Moses and Elijah are here. Let's hang out. Let me build you these temples, these tents, these booths. Let's stay here. And I read God's voice like he's chuckling a little bit or tisking a little bit. You know what I'm saying? And he kind of is like, Peter, just shut your mouth. Just shut your lips. Just don't, you have good intentions. Just don't talk right now. And then what does he say? He says, This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. You say this last one with me, 3 words. Listen to him. This is the one, God is saying, who is greater than Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah are still unseen. He goes, this is my son. This is the one I love. This is who I'm well pleased. Listen to him. Moses and Elijah pointed the way. Friends, the cool thing about this is that we read and understand scripturally that Jesus' identity, if you are in him, covers you. Meaning if you are a man in the room who has said yes to following Jesus, you are his son, who he is super pleased with. If you're a woman in the room and you've said, yes, Jesus is my God and I want to give my life to worship him, you are his daughter, beloved by God. But the identity here isn't simply to bask in. That's what Peter wants to do. Let's hang out. There's purpose in the identity. I want to put a pin in this, and we'll come back to it in just a moment. But when was the last time? This is almost the same phrase that was said in Matthew 3. If you've read Matthew, if you've been with us, what happens in Matthew 3 is Jesus gets baptized, and the God voice comes over, it descends like a dove, and it's this thing. Maybe Jesus heard it, maybe other people heard it. It says the same thing. This is my son, whom I love, with him I'm well pleased. And then what does Jesus do right after that? Does anyone remember the story? You talk to me. What's he do right after this identity is spoken? 40 days, where? In the wilderness. And chapter 4, verse 1 of Matthew's gospel says that the Spirit of God sent him to be tempted for 40 days by the devil. Great identity, don't bask in it. Here's temptation. Great identity here, don't bask in it. And we're going to see what comes up next. It's important. While Peter's words are misguided, God's words are spot on, like they are all the time. It wrecks these 3 disciples, doesn't it? Look at the next verse, verse 6. When the disciples heard this, Peter says, I shouldn't have said anything. They all fall face down to the ground, terrified, but Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. I love the response of the disciples, and I would say to us, this is a good response to experiencing God's presence in a powerful way. That he is good, and he's true. We've learned over the last few months his mercies are brand new every morning. His grace seems like it never runs out. If he's ever angry, it takes a long time to get angry. But at the same time, he is God. He spoke all of this into existence. Didn't lift a finger, he said a word. He is holy, he is magnificent. And so for Peter and James and John, there is a somewhat perfect combination where they fall on their face, that means to worship, and they're terrified at the same time. The Peter and James and John's response is what ours should be when we encounter God in a palpable, tangible, felt moment is, oh my gosh, God, you are beyond worthy to even do this for me, and I want to worship you. It's fear and awe. The interesting thing that happens here, maybe I would say this. I was praying this morning. This came super crystal clear. What is it that God's been saying to you? When you pray, when you, I don't know when you do, when you're in your car, maybe in the morning, maybe at night, you ever close your eyes, or maybe your eyes are open, Jesus prayed with his eyes open, and you listen for a moment. You say, God, what do you want me to do? That he's saying something. And I just wonder what it would look like if we listened. I know it's hard. I only know my own heart. I know some of your stories, and I know that my heart is a mess. And I know that there's things that God is saying to me, and it's hard for me to agree with them. And even my practical side will be like, well, this is a great idea, but how am I going to do it? Like, give me the details, and he doesn't do that necessarily. I would invite you, God is always speaking. What has Jesus been saying? Maybe what he's been whispering, or maybe what he's been shouting. What would it look like if you listened and obeyed? Verse 8 is an interesting one because it says, why are Moses and Elijah gone? It says they saw no one except Jesus. And the literal reading is they did not see anyone but Jesus only. It gives emphasis on the monos is the Greek word. It means only. It'd be like if all of us were worshiping and then all of a sudden the only person here was Sandy. You'd be like, what's Sandy doing here? It's this interesting thing because Elijah pointed to who? He pointed to Jesus. Moses pointed to Jesus. And the emphasis here that Matthew is telling the story is that it's not about Moses or Elijah. And you need to know, you might not know anything about Jewish culture. That's a hard truth for a Jewish person in this moment. Say, what about all the law? What about all the prophets? Those were the best. It's not about them. The piece for Peter, James, and John, who were Jewish men, is that they must focus on Jesus alone. Moses played his part as a sign. Elijah played his part as a voice. But it's all about Jesus. You have to focus on him. Everything they knew, worshiped, respected, trusted, pointed to Jesus. And how true is that for you? I needed to be reminded, so maybe you need to be reminded. It's not about your favorite pastor. Even if it's me, I appreciate that. If it's Eric, that makes a ton of sense. It's not about that, though. It's not about your favorite band. If it's our band, you go there. Or it's about a song. I love when this song comes on. All of these things that we do as the church today, or all the things that the Old Testament did, is it must point to Jesus. It is all about Jesus alone. It's not about a sermon you've heard, or a thought you've had, or a pastor you've seen, or a band, or whatever it might be. It has to be about Jesus alone. And friends, that's our heart. We love to preach good sermons. We love planning well and playing well, and we love if it's your jam. But if it doesn't point you to Jesus, we feel like we've missed it. Even after this unbelievably indescribable, ecstatic moment of majesty on the mountain, we actually see how devoted these three are to worshiping God rightly. I'm going to do this briefly, but look at verse 9. It says, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The disciples asked him, why then did the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? They're referencing Malachi chapter 3. You can look it up. Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things, but I tell you, Elijah's already come and gone. And they didn't recognize him. They did to him everything they wanted. In the same way, the Son of Man's going to suffer at their hands. Verse 13 says, the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. So, two really key things here. Verse 9 says, don't tell anyone. Why not tell anyone? Because all of the people who were anticipating Messiah throughout all of the Old Testament had ideas of what he would look like, and their two biggest enemies at the time were either Rome, so my Messiah is going to come as a military king and dominate Rome, or I don't like the religious establishment. He's going to overthrow the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the other C's and all the other Vites, whatever's out there. And if you start to tell people about this moment, they're going to force the crown on my head. And Jesus would then say, and that's not the crown I'm about to wear. But Peter, James, and John also have a question. And they say, well, we've studied, which they had. We looked at Malachi. We know Malachi 3. We've memorized it, that Elijah must come first. Do you know today when they still celebrate Passover dinner, if you're in a Jewish home, that they leave a place setting at the Passover Seder meal, and they leave the door open in case Elijah comes? I don't know if everyone does it. I looked it up, and it's like most of the Passover observance does. They're still waiting. And Peter and James and John go, well, you said in Malachi, through Malachi. And he goes, yeah, he did. It wasn't Elijah, though. It was John the Baptist, and they tortured him. They put him in jail and then beheaded him. And then he says, and they're going to do the same to me. And the crazy thing is that the disciples realize he's talking about John the Baptist in verse 13. But you have to understand that they also had a very, very strict sense of how to worship God. Maybe you have a picture of who God should be, or you have a reverence for how you worship. They're asking the right questions. I thought Elijah was supposed to come first. And he goes, he did, but they missed him. I'm here. People are going to miss me. There's one thing that's clear from this. A most important point is that Jesus is the Messiah. But I want to say thank you to Matthew for being inspired by the Spirit to create this account in God's Word. But man, I would love more detail. Would you not? He's tried to articulate it. You go, God, could you have done this when there were cell phones so we could get a high quality resolution or even a clip? Like, I'm not on TikTok, but I'd love a 10-second clip of it. I'd watch it every day. And we were like, how often could you watch that video before? But we don't have any of it because Matthew is talking about an experience that he didn't get to be part of either. He got to hear about it from Peter, James, and John. And I think it's just like some of your mountaintop experiences. Maybe it's something in life, not religiously necessarily. But think about a moment when your day is just going so well. I know we have a lot of high schoolers or young adults. The moment you graduated high school, there was just a feeling like where you had a party and you go, thank you, this is great, this is amazing, but your words can't do it justice. I think about our wedding day. We've been married over 11 years, and I remember so many people there, all happy for me, mostly happy for Kristen. She's the bride, right? But I just tell people, it's like everybody was cheering me on for like 5 hours. It was the best thing. I can't articulate enough to make you feel the same way that I felt, right? And it's the same in your faith. You have a mountaintop moment. If you don't know what that is, it's a moment when you feel the presence of God. Maybe he reveals himself to you supernaturally. And you have a hard time communicating it. Maybe it's on a mission trip. You go and you serve and you see the face of Jesus tangibly in one of the least of these. Or at least you get humbled because you realize how much you have and how much they get by with. You go, this has changed me, and you try and articulate it, and words just don't do it justice. Maybe it's Sunday service. Maybe it's a worship time. I remember when I was single and at Rock Harbor out in California, I would show up early to worship, to listen to the band worship, and then I would worship the whole way through, just singing my heart out. It was super loud. I loved it. And great messages, and I'd be taking all these notes, and then I'd worship, and I would try and tell people about it, but I was just like, you know? Have you ever been there? Do you know what I'm talking about, though? The funny thing is that Peter wants to stay on the mountain, but God says, shush your lips, Peter. But then what does Jesus do next? Verse 9 says that they were walking down the mountain. Now look at verse 14. It says they came to a crowd. A man approached Jesus and knelt before him. That's a posture of worship. Lord, have mercy on my son. He said he has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire, into the water. I think the piece that God wants to say in these mountaintop moments is enjoy them, but don't stay there. We want to stay there. Remember the glory days. How is that good? Friends, 704 Church, if you're watching online, we follow a Jesus who is on the move. He loves those mountaintop moments. He loves that you get to encounter his goodness in a way that you can't put words to. He kind of laughs. He's like, I've got words for it, but I'm not telling you those yet. You just need to soak it in. Struggle to tell people about it because it was so good. And maybe even when I say that, let me say it again. Jesus is on the move. I wonder what that does to you. There's a great book that you probably know, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And there's a line that's very similar. C.S. Lewis wrote it. They're going to have the quote up there. It's early on in the book, and it says, they say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps he has already landed. This is really beautiful. I think it's what happens to us. Now, a very curious thing happened. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in its inside. Edmund, who, if you haven't read the book, is kind of a turd, felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her, and Lucy, the youngest, got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it's the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. Friends, you need to know that Jesus is on the move. He loves those mountaintop experiences, but it's not just about that. That identity is spoken over him for a purpose, and your experience of God's goodness and glory, whether it's on a literal mountain or not, is not just for that moment. It's to equip you for something else. Look at verse 14. They came to the crowd. A man approached Jesus. 15, have mercy on my son. So this is a random guy with a random son. Peter's like, I haven't even had time to blog about this, you know? Like, I need to tell my friends, but Jesus said not to, so I'm going to write it, and I'm going to hold it, but I'm right here, and there's this random dude, stop bothering Jesus. And then the guy throws him under the bus. Did you read verse 16? It says, I brought him to your disciples, and they couldn't do anything. If you've ever been thrown under the bus, the disciples were too. And they're like, which one are you talking about? You know, like, but what does Jesus say? He doesn't hold back. He says, you unbelieving and perverse generation. How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. Jesus rebuked the demon, And it came out of the boy, and he was healed at the moment. So in Matthew 3, Jesus gets identity spoken over to be tempted. In Matthew 17, he gets identity spoken over him into ministry. I think that we often like to see the majesty of the mountaintop and we stay there, but then we forget about the mess of ministry, right? And it's your life. Your life is ministry. It's not just Sunday. It's not just serving on hospitality, though that is, and we love it. It's not just leading a life group. Every moment, 24 hours, 7 days a week is your ministry, and it is messy. Maybe now more than ever with everything that's happening. It's confusing, it's perplexing, it's hard. And the interesting thing is that the reason Jesus rebukes Peter at the end of Matthew 16 is that he says, there's going to be glory. There's going to be glory. The king is going to return. It's me. I'm going to be enthroned in glory, but it's not by way of triumph. It's by way of suffering. It's where the word via dolorosa means. It means road of suffering, hardship, persecution, and murder. And what does he say at the end of 16 is that you're going to have to go through the same thing. If you've taken this call to follow Jesus seriously, there is absolutely glory for sure. There's going to be moments when you experience it, and it'll change your heart, and it'll allow you to keep going on. And there's going to be a day when Jesus returns, and it will be glory beyond glory that we will not have words to articulate, or maybe by that point we will, because God will give them to us. But the road to that glory is the same road that Jesus took. It's via dolorosa. It's through suffering. It's through hardship. It's through people abandoning you. It's through being hurt. It's through all of these different challenges that we can see laid out in the text is that I have this mountaintop moment that I got to go to the mess of ministry right after. I don't know whatever the mess of ministry might be for you. I want to get practical. Maybe it's a text message or a phone call in the middle of worship service. You're loving it. Maybe it's funny. Today we're worshiping and we're actually getting our 3-year-old to finally do it. And then I see him pull his shirt up and he has a toy that he's trying to put in his pants. And he tells the other girl next, close your eyes. And I go, I'm super distracted. This is a great song. Lincoln, what do you? And then I was able to laugh at it. Literally happened 30 minutes ago. I don't know what it is for you. Maybe it's you go on the missions trip and you have this awesome life-changing moment and you've experienced God's face in these children, or you've seen how much you have, and then you open your email the next day and it's flooded with junk and you get call after call and frustration after frustration. But friends, I think the majesty of the mountaintop happens for the mess of ministry. And oftentimes we even look at Sunday service. I love to come here because I get so poured into. My week's been so hard. But I want to shift the way that we think. I want to shift the way that we look at if I can just get enough, if I can hold off until Sunday. But what if we looked at Sunday as the literal first day of the week? Because I believe it is. Whatever, you can argue with me. Sunday's the first day of the week, and you're getting a mountaintop, maybe not like Transfiguration, maybe not like a mission trip, maybe not like your best song ever, or best worship, or best pastor, but you're getting poured into so that you can make it through the mess of ministry. That if we can look at this moment, and it's not just on Sunday, it has to be every morning, that I'm reading the Word and I'm getting prepared for the stuff that is in front of me, because in your own strength, you cannot handle it. It's so hard. The end of this passage is interesting. The disciples, verse 19, came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? He says this great phrase, because you have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible. I would challenge you with this. What faith do you need? I think that's a question. And we see it in today's text. If you want to flip back to verse 5, and they might put it up on here. We see the faith that we need based on the identity that God spoke over him. We can experience the majesty of the mountain for the mess of the ministry. It will build our faith. 2 key pieces that you have to see in this identity statement. He says, first, this is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. First and above all, your faith should be a commitment to Jesus alone. Jesus talks about it himself, that if you don't hate your mother and father, you can't follow me. He's using an extreme comparison, meaning the way you love me and are committed to me should make it look like you hate them to everybody else. You don't need to hate them. Meaning you need to be first committed to Jesus more than your spouse, than your kids, than your work, than your fun, than your time, than whatever it is. And secondly, what does he say at the very end? We said it together, 3 words. What? Listen to him. How do you have faith? Is in prayer. And not just speaking your litany of complaints or frustrations or all of the maladies and calamities that you have. And I think when he gets to how you have faith, he says you only need a little bit of faith because it's not about the measure of faith in you, it's about the power of God you have faith in. Is that right? And so when he says you can move mountains, we go, okay, I'm following Jesus. He's the only one. I want to worship him. And I'm listening and praying, and I walk out of here and I read this text and I go, where's the mountain? I should probably move it, it says. But that's not listening to Jesus, is it? And honestly, if we want to move a mountain, we have machinery for that. We don't need the miraculous to move a hill over and over, right? But I think that's probably the holdup, is that oftentimes we can think that we don't have enough faith and this malady or calamity isn't being fixed, or we can say we have to do it in our own strength. And if you do either of those things, you're going to guilt and shame yourself and worse, others. When they say, well, you don't have enough faith, that's why you weren't healed, or you don't have enough faith, that's why you didn't get the job, or I don't have enough faith, that's why my kids are rebellious, or why my kid pulled his shirt up and tried to put a toy in his pants in the middle of worship. I don't know what it might be, but the 2 facets that we have to look at is, are you committed to Jesus and Jesus alone? Are you doing the things in your life to get to know him more? Are you praying? Are you listening? It's a great segue to prayer week. Maybe you haven't prayed in months or years. Maybe you're not going to show up, but you say, hey, from 7:30 to 8:30, I'm shutting everything off. Sending my kids to bed, whatever their bedtime is. I'm going to turn my phone off so my friends won't call. I'm not going to look at the TV, and I'm just going to pray, and I'm going to listen. Whatever it might be. You might still be wondering why you can trust him, and I want to finish with this. I know I'm going over a little bit. I love... we have the majesty of the mountaintop, and we have the mess of ministry, and we have a map to how to do it. They're both part of our lives. Pray for those mountaintop experiences, but not just in and of themselves, because they equip you into the mess of ministry that is your life. It will start here in a few minutes when you leave this building. Maybe it's already started right now. You got a text. I have no clue, probably. But there's another map that's really, really beautiful. I read this, and it's wonderful. Because the mountaintop actually points to a hilltop. You ever considered this? That here on the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus is revealed in glory. Do you know, at Golgotha, he is revealed and covered in shame. Here, Jesus' clothes are shining white. There, at the cross, Jesus' clothes have been stripped away and gambled for by soldiers. Here, Jesus is flanked by Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, representing all of God's holy people. There, who's he flanked by? 2 criminals who represent the depth that the people of the place had gone to. Here, a bright cloud overshadows the scene. The presence of God radiates. There, it says, darkness covers the land. That's neat. Here, Peter blurts out how wonderful all it is. He's kind of a dummy, but he's still trying. Where's he at the cross? He's hiding in shame because he just abandoned Jesus 3 times to a slave girl and another servant and then to a crowd of nobodies. Here, the voice of God declares that this is his wonderful son whom he loves and he's well pleased. There, that voice is from a pagan soldier who says, surprisingly, this truly was the Son of God. The last one. Friends, this mountaintop points to the hilltop. And why you can trust him is because Jesus is the Messiah radiated in his future glory in Matthew 17. It's also in Mark and Luke. Look it up. He's in glory, and it's going to come someday. And the Jesus that we worship was covered in shame on this hilltop. Your shame, your sin. You can trust someone who shows you how great he is and then stoops to the lowest level to invite you to be a part of that on that day. This Jesus is on the move. Maybe for you it is a realization. I felt like that was a clear moment this morning. Is that we often look back at the mountaintop moments and be like, oh, I wish I could go back to that. I wish I could have that again. I wish I could experience that. And I want to say the 2 words, idols and altars. Our old church, Rock Harbor, is doing a series like that. It's really a beautiful thing. Is that you can make an idol out of the past. You can make an idol out of that mountaintop. Be like, we should build a tent here and hang out and never leave and worship here and make this everything. I had that moment. I encountered God powerfully there. The difference in an idol and an altar is you look back and you say, that was a powerful moment. I look at the mission trips I've been on, the worship services I've been able to be a part of. I've felt God's presence. Even looking at this week and thinking about fasting, I know that if I can go through a fast, I'm going to be hungry for God in a way that I'm not when I'm eating. And I'm so excited for it because I know the experience of that mountaintop previously. And that's an altar. Your life is hard. You're going to go home. Maybe it's going to start right now. You just get a phone call. You're going to wake up tomorrow and the mess of ministry is going to happen. You can look back and say, I'm going to reread Matthew 17. Jesus is going to come in glory. He invites me into that. And the truth of this passage is that his road to glory is through suffering. And so when you go through any type of suffering or hardship, you go, he said this would happen. He knew it was going to come up. So you make an altar out of it. You worship Jesus because of the goodness of the past, not an idol where you want to get back to that and get back to that and get back to that. I prayed this morning and I thought it was for me, but it just came back to mind. When I was praying about you guys and myself, the phrase really clearly came up that it was as God was saying to me, you are able. You're strong enough, not because of you have this own strength, but because the Spirit of God lives in you. Maybe you're wrestling with something. Maybe I know my thing that I'm wrestling with is my personality. Sometimes I can be impatient with my kids and not think about others. I can be very selfish, and I want to overcome it. And I felt like God was just saying, you can do it. Not because you're smart enough or good enough, because the Spirit of God is in you. I'm with you. Maybe there's something in you. You feel like you can't get over the hurdle of whatever it is. And if God wants to say that you are capable because I'm with you. I want to bless you and pray a prayer over you. And so would you open your hands if you're watching online? You can just take a posture wherever you are. Friends, I pray that the Spirit of God would call to mind the mountaintop moments you've had with him. I pray that he would bless you with more of those. I pray that you would experience God's presence in a way that you can't put into words. Maybe today, maybe in the middle of the week when you're not expecting it, you are just hit by his presence. And I pray that the mountaintops you've had and the ones that you will have would equip you to walk faithfully and courageously through this mess of ministry that is life. May you be reminded that there will come a day when you will be with Jesus in all of his glory. He will be a king seated on a throne, on a chariot, in a world that's been created for you since before this world existed. It is a beautiful promise. May you see Jesus both now and how he's been in your life and where your life is going. All God's people said, amen. Go in peace, friends.